What happens when the woman you've been waiting for turns out to be more than you bargained for, quite literally, head and shoulders above the rest? In this captivating frontier tale, the moment of truth arrives right on the train platform, where a man sees the bride he's promised to marry and rejects her on the spot for being too tall. Heartbroken but determined, our heroine refuses to fade into the background, carving out a life in a rugged logging town that proves her worth in ways no one expects. Will this rejection be the end of her dream, or the spark that leads her to something far better? Stay with us for the full story to find out how courage and genuine acceptance triumph over narrow-mindedness. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to support stories like this. By subscribing, you'll help us share more heartfelt narratives and ensure you never miss an update. Ophelia Clarkson first set eyes on the rugged settlement of Silver Pine Gulch when the steam locomotive screeched to a halt at the small, weathered platform. Standing almost 6 feet tall, she gripped her worn leather suitcase with a mix of excitement and dread. For nearly 38 years, she had navigated a world in which she literally loomed over the most acquaintance, including men who prided themselves on matching her height, but seldom actually did. This new place, nestled against imposing pine forests and snow-capped peaks, had been described in detail by the man who had invited her here, Thomas Whitmore. He claimed to be a sawmill owner in need of a practical, nurturing wife to help him build a life in the distant West. Their 6 months of correspondence had brimmed with kindness and hope on the page. As the whistle died away, Ophelia took a moment to smooth her best traveling dress, an emerald green wool piece she had sewn herself. She inhaled the crisp Oregon air, a distinct scent of pine resin and damp earth that clung to the towering evergreens around the station. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across a muddy main street flanked by a general store, 2 saloons, a small bank, and a modest white church with peeling paint. It felt both humble and grand compared to her cramped Boston lodgings. She had pinned all her hopes on this journey, to meet Thomas Whitmore in person and forge a new beginning far from the veiled ridicule she had endured back east. Her first steps onto the platform proved awkward. A group of loggers leaned against the saloon railing, sawdust still clinging to their flannel shirts. They gawked with outright curiosity at the sight of a tall woman clearly more refined and dressed than the average arrival. Some stared, others nudged one another as if they had been expecting her. The wave of self-consciousness came in an instant, but Ophelia refused to shrink under their gaze. She reminded herself that the man who had written such affectionate letters hadn't asked about her height, and she had not volunteered that information, largely because she was wary of being judged. Here in Silver Pine Gulch, she was determined to be seen as more than a spectacle. "Miss Clarkson," a male voice called, snapping her out of her thoughts. Turning, Ophelia found herself looking down upon Thomas Whitmore, who stood at least 4 inches shorter than her. He wore a neat suit, sandy brown hair slicked into place, and a tidy beard that emphasized his angular face. He had a confident air about him, until he took full measure of her stature. In that moment, Ophelia noticed his features tense, as though he were grappling with something unexpected. "You are Thomas Whitmore," she asked, extending her gloved hand. A smile that had grown rigid on his face faltered completely. "Indeed," he replied, forcing a grin. "It's good to finally meet you, Miss Clarkson." His gaze traveled from her face down to her sturdy boots, then back up, revealing his unmasked surprise. For a moment, silence hung between them, while the loggers in the background exchanged amused glances. Thomas cleared his throat. "Shall we, step over here for a moment?" Ophelia followed him, gripping her suitcase as if it were a life preserver. She expected some initial shock. She was used to it, but hoped that his gentle nature, as evidenced in those letters, would prevail. Instead, his face tightened in discomfort. "You didn't mention," he hesitated, searching for a polite phrase. "Your letters never said you were quite so tall." She resisted the urge to sigh. "Does it matter?" Thomas's expression revealed his immediate answer before words did. "I'm afraid it does," he said quietly, lowering his voice. "I have a position here in town, you see. People look up to me, figuratively. It might be awkward if my wife—" He paused again, eyes flickering to the curious onlookers. "This arrangement, I'm sorry, I don't think it'll work." Shock and disbelief jostled for space in Ophelia's mind. She had sacrificed what little she had to travel thousands of miles for this man. You've changed your mind because I'm taller than you expected? She asked, struggling to keep emotion from her voice. He nodded almost apologetically. Forgive me, Miss Clarkson, but a wife should... He trailed off, blushing. Then he mumbled, I'll see that you're placed on a train back to Boston. It leaves tomorrow morning. Perhaps we can pretend this never happened. Ophelia stared, her heart pounding, as laughter from the onlooking loggers drifted their way. Her fantasy of acceptance, love, and partnership shattered in an instant. I spent everything I had to get here, she managed. There is no home to return to. Thomas's discomfort bled into frustration. I can't be expected to carry on with a woman who so obviously doesn't fit. And with that painful statement, he touched his hat in a curt goodbye and hurried away, leaving Ophelia on the platform, humiliated, lost, and uncertain of her next steps. The loggers outside the saloon took particular note of Thomas's abrupt departure. A few of them snickered. One called out, Need a hand with that suitcase, miss? It's almost as big as you are. More laughter followed. Ophelia, cheeks burning, clutched her baggage more tightly, forcing herself not to react. She would not give those men the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Taking the muddy main street in long strides, she left the train platform behind without a destination in mind. She couldn't bear to watch Thomas receding further into the distance. Past the saloons and near the edge of town, the buildings gave way to thick stands of pine. The late autumn sun cast a golden glow across everything, but it offered little warmth to Ophelia's chilled spirit. She found a felled log to sit on, set her suitcase down, and tried to calm her racing thoughts. Would she truly have to board the train back to Boston with no money for a return ticket and no home upon arrival? She pressed her fingertips to her temples, recalling the pitying expressions from the onlookers. Anger flickered in her chest, mingling with sorrow. She had never asked to be so tall, nor had she expected to be cast aside for it so bluntly. Hard day? Came a voice that was both resonant and gentle. Ophelia jerked upright. Standing a few yards away was a man who dwarfed almost everyone she'd encountered in her life. He wore rolled-up sleeves over muscular arms, a thick beard framing a strong jaw. His eyes were a clear, startling blue. On his head was a cap that couldn't quite contain his thick, dark hair. He smiled, though not in a way that suggested mockery. Didn't mean to startle you, he said, stepping forward. I'm Alexander Redwood. I manage the Redwood logging camp a few miles north of here. She rose to her feet, surprised to find that he stood at least 3 inches taller than she did. A small bloom of relief ignited in her mind, though she quickly stifled it. Ophelia Clarkson, she replied. Just arrived on the train. He glanced back toward the distant station. Then you must be the lady Thomas Whitmore was talking up in the saloon these past weeks. He said a bride was coming from back east. Seems he left in a hurry. A rush of pain burned in her chest. Yes, well, he changed his mind. She tried to sound dismissive, but a quiver in her voice betrayed her heartbreak. He finds me unsuitable. Alexander's brow furrowed. Unsuitable how? Ophelia couldn't hold his gaze for a moment. I'm too tall, she said, voice shaking with anger. It never came up in our letters, so apparently my entire worth as a person is undone by a few extra inches of height. Alexander let out a quiet sigh. Thomas Whitmore cares too much about appearances. It's not the first time he's shown poor judgment. He took a few steps closer, still maintaining a polite distance. You have somewhere to stay tonight? She shook her head. He offered to ship me back, but I sold everything to come here. I've nowhere else to go. The final admission left her stomach churning with shame. I know of a reputable boarding house, Alexander said. Geraldine Hines runs it. She's good-hearted and doesn't hold with gossip. If you'd like, I can show you the way. Ophelia hesitated. How could she trust this stranger when another had shattered her hopes so thoroughly just hours ago? Yet something in Alexander's calm manner, and perhaps the unself-conscious way he stood taller than her without the slightest flinch, reassured her. Why are you helping me? He set his hands on his hips and glanced at the horizon where the sun dipped behind the pines. Because I've seen how people in this town treat those who don't meet their expectations. And because no one should be stranded at nightfall with no plan, doesn't feel right. The directness of his answer disarmed her. Thank you, she said softly. Gathering her suitcase, she walked with him back toward the cluster of buildings. She noticed some curious gazes tracking them, but Alexander seemed oblivious or indifferent. He walked with a poised confidence that deflected ridicule. They arrived at a two-story home with white siding and green shutters. A wooden sign, Hines Boarding House, was tacked above the door. Geraldine Hines, a stout woman with silver-threaded hair, opened the door, broom in hand. She gave Ophelia a once-over, but if she was startled by Ophelia's remarkable height, she hid it well. "Well now," Geraldine said, voice full of warmth. "You must be new in town. Come in, dear. Don't let the chill get you." Ophelia turned to Alexander, an unexpected twinge of gratitude welling up in her. "I'm in your debt, Mr. Redwood." "Alexander," he corrected. "No debt here, just neighborly kindness. I'm heading back to my camp tomorrow, but I'm sure we'll cross paths again soon." She caught herself hoping it would be true, then banished the thought with an inward sigh. "Thank you, Alexander, truly." Geraldine drew Ophelia inside, and Alexander walked away, his tall figure silhouetted briefly by the fading sun. The boarding house, though modest, exuded a sense of coziness and safety. Geraldine showed her to a small room on the second floor, the bed a touch short for Ophelia's frame. Still, it was inviting, with crisp linens and a cheery quilt. The door frame was high enough that she didn't need to stoop, an amenity that both surprised and comforted her. The events of the day crashed over her the moment she sat on the bed. Tears crept up despite her resolve, rolling down her cheeks as the humiliation replayed in her mind. Just that morning, she had been certain of a new life in this frontier town as someone's treasured partner. Now she felt more alone than ever. After a subdued meal in the communal dining room where she met a few other boarders, Ophelia tried to sleep, but her thoughts drifted to the man who had so matter-of-factly accepted Seabairn, who had looked into her eyes without an ounce of shame. The following day, she told herself, she would gather her wits and figure out a plan, one that didn't rely on the approval of a short-sighted mill owner. Maybe, just maybe, her journey had begun precisely the way it needed to, painful as it felt now. Morning brought faint sunlight creeping through lace curtains. Ophelia woke with a dull ache in her chest, the heartbreak and embarrassment of the prior day emerging in a dreary swirl. Still, she was no stranger to adversity and had survived awkward adolescence, scornful suitors, and endless jokes about her height. This too she would survive. She pinned her dark hair into a practical bun, donned a clean blouse and skirt, and made her way downstairs. The smell of fresh biscuits and coffee drew her to the small kitchen, where Geraldine was busy at the stove. "Morning, dear," Geraldine greeted. "Hope you're hungry. We do hearty breakfast here. Just a bit of everything thrown on the table. Helps keep folks going through the day." Ophelia managed a faint smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Hines. I can pay a bit once I figure out employment." Geraldine waved a hand dismissively. "There's time enough for that. Alexander Redwood told me you're a seamstress by trade, yes?" She nodded toward the small back room where a sewing machine sat on a sturdy table. "That was my hobby once upon a time. You're welcome to use the space if you aim to take on projects." It was a kindness Ophelia hadn't expected. She eyed the neglected sewing corner with a flicker of hope. "I do have sewing experience, simple dresses, work clothes, repairs. If that's needed here, I might be able to pay my way." Geraldine's round face broke into a smile. "Needed? My dear, the local seamstress is half blind, and the townsfolk have been complaining for months about the lack of anyone else to mend clothes or do simple tailoring. I'll spread the word that you're available. Could keep you plenty busy." Despite the relief that washed over her, Ophelia couldn't ignore the memory of Thomas's public rejection. "What if people won't hire me because, well, because of your height?" Geraldine finished gently. "Some might gawk, but the rest will see a talented seamstress, especially once they need your help. Folks in small towns don't remain picky once there's a hole in their best trousers or a wedding dress in need of perfect fitting." After breakfast, Ophelia set to work reorganizing the back room, dusting off the sewing machine, and taking inventory of the leftover notions and fabrics. She was wrapping a measuring tape around a bolt of cloth when a shadow appeared in the doorway. Turning, she saw Alexander Redwood, hat in hand, wearing a coat dusted with morning dew. His broad shoulders nearly filled the frame. "Morning," and he said. "Geraldine told me you might be in here." Ophelia, flustered by how his presence made the small room feel suddenly close, nodded in greeting. "I thought you were returning to your camp today." "I am," Alexander replied, stepping inside cautiously. Wanted to check on you before I ride out. After yesterday, I just wanted to make sure you have everything you need. A trace of concern underlined his words. Ophelia looked down at the measuring tape coiled in her hand. I'm taking Geraldine's offer to do seamstress work. Seems the town has a shortage of practical clothing repairs, and I have the skills. A flicker of approval lit up his eyes. That's good. There's no reason to let Thomas Whitmore's small-mindedness drive you away. Besides, he added with a half-smile, my own logging camp constantly needs repairs on torn shirts and ripped pants. And winter is coming. Heavy gear will require upkeep. She found herself unexpectedly grateful. You'd bring me that kind of business? He shrugged. Why not? Our current arrangements for repairs are subpar at best. If you're willing, I'll send a few men into town next week with items that need mending. We'll pay fairly. The promise of reliable, paying work eased the knot in her stomach. Thank you, Mr. Redwood. That's more generous than you know. It's simply mutually beneficial, he said. And it's Alexander, remember? He offered a small bow, which she found oddly charming. I'll be back in a few days, once I've got my men and supplies organized. Before she could reply, he glanced around the sunlit back room. This suits you. You look at home here. Her cheeks warmed at the offhand compliment. After Thomas's harsh dismissal, Alexander's acceptance felt undeserved. She struggled to articulate her thanks in a way that matched his directness. You've been very kind to me. If there's ever a way I can repay that. He waved a hand as if swatting away a trivial matter. You already have. Something about your determination reminded me that not everyone bows down to gossip and superficial judgments. People here can learn from that. A moment passed, the two simply sharing an understanding glance. Then Alexander said his farewells, reminding her once more that he'd send work from the logging camp. Ophelia followed him to the front door, where he departed into the strengthening morning light, leaving her with the exhilarating sense that perhaps her dreams of a new beginning hadn't died on the station platform after all. Ophelia settled into Geraldine's boarding house over the next few days, gradually finding her place in the rhythms of Silver Pine Gulch. She rose early each morning to begin sewing tasks, simultaneously aware that she had to prove herself as a proficient seamstress if she hoped to survive financially. Townsfolk, at first startled by her height, became more receptive once they realized she wasn't afraid to greet them with a calm smile and an offer of mending their garments. She stitched skirts for the postmaster's wife, patched flannel shirts for a couple of local ranch hands, and soon found small coin flowing in. Though there were whispers, there always were, many recognized her skill, and that trumped prejudice in a frontier town. Even so, she spotted Thomas Whitmore once or twice on the street, each time feeling a spike of humiliation. He would pointedly cross to the opposite side as if to avoid a conversation. Ophelia resented how quickly he seemed to have dismissed her entire existence, but she reminded herself that she owed him nothing. One chilly morning, a logger arrived carrying a large sack of ripped trousers, stained shirts, and mismatched socks. Name's Roger, he said. I work for Redwood Logging. The boss says you're the one to fix these, Bem. The mention of Alexander Redwood quickened Ophelia's pulse. She tried to keep her voice even. I'll do my best. Let me see what's in here. Unpacking the garments, she assessed the condition of each piece. Some needed more reconstructive effort than straightforward patching, but she was more than capable. Roger whistled in awe as she showed him sample stitches, calling them better than I've seen since my ma died. He paid in advance for half the work, an unexpected courtesy that suggested Alexander Redwood's influence. With so much to do, the days blurred. Ophelia hardly noticed a week pass until Geraldine reminded her about the upcoming Saturday social at the local church. Music, dancing, potluck, Geraldine explained while ironing. A chance to meet folks who haven't yet strolled by the boarding house. You should go. Ophelia set down her spool of thread. She had never been much for town dances, especially after a string of rejections back east. Dancing is complicated for me, she admitted. Geraldine caught her meaning. Worried about overshadowing a dance partner, are you? She smiled sympathetically. You should consider it. Not everyone here is as small-minded as Thomas. Perhaps you'll find yourself enjoying the night. And so, come Saturday evening, Ophelia wrapped herself in her best shawl, a warm burgundy wool, and walked with Geraldine to the modest church hall. It was lit by lanterns and decorated with autumn leaves. Inside, a fiddler warmed up while families chatted, children squealed, and the entire space thrummed with a sense of communal festivity. Several folks greeted Ophelia. Some recognized her from mending jobs. Others offered polite half-smiles. She could feel the usual stares, but they were tempered by curiosity rather than malice. Scanning the room, she spotted no sign of Thomas Whitmore, much to her relief. Geraldine introduced her to a few townspeople. A school teacher in need of new dresses, the blacksmith's wife who wanted curtains, a ranching couple who asked about flannel repairs. These practical conversations offset the occasional odd glance from people still adjusting to her height. In the background, the fiddler launched into a lively reel, prompting couples to form pairs on the dance floor. Ophelia watched, half envious. She wondered how many men would even consider dancing with her. Over the years, she had perfected a slightly hunched stance to seem less imposing, but Alexander Redwood's calm acceptance lingered in her memory. He wasn't here, though. As Geraldine peeled off to chat with an old friend, Ophelia stood by the refreshment table, sampling apple pie and trying to look busy. Then, in the hush that comes after a rousing tune, the door at the far side of the hall swung open. A tall figure stepped in, shoulders dusted with the swirl of chill wind. Ophelia's pulse stuttered. Alexander Redwood wore clean trousers and a fitted shirt, his thick beard neatly trimmed. He glanced around as if wary, then spotted her in the crowd. Relief crossed his face, replaced by a reserved smile that made her heart skip. She hadn't expected him to come. He'd implied social gatherings weren't his scene. He picked his way through the throng, offering nods here and there. When he reached her, the rest of the crowd seemed to disappear, or at least fade into irrelevance. "Ophelia," he said, simply stating her name as though it were a greeting all its own. She swallowed back a surge of gratitude. "I didn't think you liked these events." He shrugged. "Figured I'd try a change of habit. How's your sewing?" "Going well. You must have brought me half your camp's wardrobe," she teased, lifting her chin in an almost playful challenge. Alexander's expression grew relaxed. "They appreciate good craftsmanship. That's all you." Before either could say more, the fiddler struck up another reel. A hush of anticipation swept the spectators. Couples drifted onto the dance floor. Something unreadable flickered in Alexander's eyes. He set down his coat on a nearby chair and turned to her. "Want to give it a try?" Ophelia froze. She glanced at the dancers, a mix of older couples and awkward teenagers. "I haven't danced in years." Me neither," Alexander confessed. "But we can stumble around together if you like. And I'm tall enough not to trip over your feet," he added, lips quirking. She inhaled, then nodded. "All right, let's see if we remember how it's done." As he led her to the floor, whispers fluttered through the hall. The tall seamstress was going to dance with the tall logger. They aligned awkwardly at first, his broad hands settling at her waist, her free hand resting on his shoulder. For once, she didn't have to angle downward or shift uncomfortably to accommodate a shorter partner. Their eyes nearly aligned, and at the fiddler's cue, the music swept them into motion. They navigated the pattern hesitantly, Alexander murmuring apologies whenever they mixed steps. Ophelia found herself laughing, shoulders loosening. Dancing had never been enjoyable with men who made her feel monstrous. But with Alexander Redwood's easy confidence, she didn't feel huge, just in harmony. As the reel intensified, he even spun her in a quick flourish. Their combined height made them stand out, but for a rare moment she didn't mind. She was simply a woman dancing with a man who neither resented nor feared her presence. When the tune ended, a smattering of applause covered the flush in her cheeks. "Thank you," she said, breathless. Alexander nodded, also catching his breath. "You dance well, Ophelia, and you stand tall in every sense." The warm sincerity in his voice made her heart flutter in a way she hadn't felt in a decade. Then the fiddler called for a slower waltz, and couples rearranged. Alexander's gaze was clear. "Another?" she agreed, letting the gentle music guide them. Whispers echoed around, no doubt full of speculation, but Ophelia found she cared less than ever about small-town gossip. The following week arrived with a burst of crisp morning air and the tang of winter's approach. Ophelia's sewing work expanded beyond simple repairs. Ranch wives commissioned new aprons. The saloon owner requested sturdy curtains, and a handful of children needed heavier garments for the chilly nights. In between these local jobs, she steadily tackled the pile of items from redwood logging. She found satisfaction not just in the money, but in the sense of independence that came from meeting a steady demand. She no longer questioned her place. She had earned it, and word was spreading. Meanwhile, Alexander Redwood became a regular presence in town. Sometimes he brought more work from the camp. Other times he claimed to be checking on deliveries. But Ophelia noticed how he always found time to visit her little sewing space, arriving with some fresh anecdote from the forest, a question about how she was faring, or perhaps a bit of quiet companionship. There were moments they sat side by side, her sewing away while he recounted the day's challenges: wet logs, a broken saw, or a near miss with a falling branch. She marveled at how easily conversation flowed between them, a far cry from the strained small talk she'd practiced with men in Boston. One evening, to her surprise, Alexander invited her to dine at the hotel's modest restaurant, a place known for trout caught fresh from the nearby rivers. For some reason, the idea of a public dinner made her stomach flutter with nerves. Geraldine's teasing smile as Ophelia pinned up her hair only heightened that sense of anticipation. "You two look well matched, you know," Geraldine said, her gentle approval evident. "Tall, capable, not ones to bow to petty gossip." Ophelia wore her favorite dress, a deep green that highlighted her dark hair. She pinned at the collar a small brooch she'd acquired from a Boston shop, though it wasn't especially fancy. Arriving at the restaurant, she found Alexander waiting, freshly groomed, clearly out of his comfort zone in more formal attire. The host, somewhat taken aback by the pair's combined height, seated them near a window that overlooked the main street. Lantern light glowed around them, reflecting softly on the polished table. From the start, the conversation drifted to their personal histories. Ophelia confessed her years of being overlooked by suitors who couldn't see past her stature. Alexander shared how he'd risen from a simple logger to foreman and finally to camp manager, forging alliances and respect through honest work. Their candor never felt forced. Indeed, every moment felt like a quiet validation that they belonged in each other's company. Over a plate of trout and vegetables, they touched upon topics beyond themselves. He asked about her impressions of Silver Pine Gulch. She inquired about the complexities of managing so many men, many of whom took their wages right to the saloon. Between the steady hum of other diners and the clink of cutlery, they forged an intimacy based not on grand gestures, but on shared truths. As dinner wound down, Alexander cleared his throat, looking slightly uneasy. "I have another proposal. A business one." "Oh?" She tensed, unsure if he meant something that might overshadow their growing friendship, or something that might entangle them further. He explained that redwood logging would soon need winter coats, gloves, scarves, enough to outfit at least 30 men for harsh conditions. "We usually order from Portland," he said, "but shipments get delayed or the items aren't durable enough for real logging work. I'd like you to make them if you're willing. I'll pay in advance for materials, and you'll have a guaranteed contract. It's a lot of work, but I trust your skill." Ophelia blinked at the scope of it. If she agreed, she'd be busier than ever, but also more financially secure than she'd dared hope. She weighed the time constraints. "When do you need them finished?" "In a month, before the snow grows too deep. I realize it's short notice." She pressed her palm to her chest, feeling a spark of excitement. "I'd have to buy substantial fabric, heavy wool, canvas, and warm linings. But if you can pay in advance..." Alexander produced an envelope. "This should cover it. Consider the rest your profit upon completion." Inside was more money than she'd ever handled at one time. The sincerity of his trust in her coaxed away any hesitation. She met his gaze. "I accept." A flicker of something more than relief crossed his face, as though he were proud. When they concluded the evening, he insisted on walking her back to Geraldine's in the crisp starlight. The hush of the sleeping town contrasted sharply with their brisk footsteps and quiet laughter. At her doorstep, he wished her a soft good night, though his expression said he might have lingered if he dared. Ophelia stepped inside with a heart oddly lighter than it had been in years, hugging that envelope to her chest as a symbol not just of financial stability, but of a man's respect for her abilities and personhood. The days that followed swept Ophelia into an all-consuming whirlwind of cutting and stitching. She purchased bolts of heavy wool, sturdy canvas, and thick thread from the local mercantile. Bundles of uncut material piled around her sewing station until Geraldine joked that the house might collapse under the weight of her ambition. But Ophelia pressed on, measuring, cutting patterns, double reinforcing seams, testing fit on volunteer loggers and ensuring each piece would survive the brutal damp and cold of an Oregon winter. Alexander dropped by intermittently, his visits short but supportive. He brought hot chocolate one stormy afternoon, teased her about burying herself in cloth, and even tried on a prototype coat to help her gauge the correct shoulder width. The companionable ease between them only grew. With each short interaction, she felt the warmth of his presence linger, fueling her long hours at the sewing machine. She found herself daydreaming about him in the quiet moments, recalling how it felt dancing in his arms, or the understated compliment he'd given about her standing tall. Halfway through the contract, the first dusting of snow arrived, blanketing Silver Pine Gulch with a serene hush. By then, the rest of the town had grown used to the sight of the tall seamstress bent over her tasks day and night in that back room. Some of the same folks who had once ridiculed her height now brought coffee or small treats, offering appreciation for the new sense of pride her workmanship brought to the town. Even so, not everyone was welcoming. Thomas Whitmore, for instance, glowered whenever they crossed paths, though he refrained from outward insult. Ophelia surmised that her prosperity, facilitated by Alexander Redwood, rankled him somehow. Just as the final items neared completion, an unforeseen tension surfaced. Rumors spread that Lucy Parker, previously engaged to Alexander Redwood and rumored to have left the settlement in disgrace, had returned to town, assisting Dr. Hendricks, her uncle, with medical duties. The talk among the loggers and general store customers hinted that Lucy regretted fleeing and might still hold feelings for Alexander. Ophelia, on hearing these whispers, tried to dismiss them. She wasn't typically prone to jealousy, but she'd experienced enough heartbreak to remain cautious. She recalled only that Alexander had once mentioned a broken engagement, though he hadn't elaborated in detail. After finishing the final row of stitches on a thick canvas coat one afternoon, she was startled by a knock at the door. Opening it, she found Lucy Parker standing there. Lucy was petite, with features that gave her an air of refined elegance. She held a parcel of dresses, explaining, "I need some adjustments made. People say you're the best around." Ophelia admitted Lucy politely, ignoring the faint knot in her stomach. As she pinned and measured Lucy's dresses, she noticed Lucy's cordial questions. "How are you finding Silver Pine Gulch? Settled in well? Heard you've been working closely with Alexander Redwood." She phrased everything lightly, but Ophelia couldn't ignore the subtext. "He commissioned winter gear for his logging crew," Ophelia said evenly, trying not to let suspicion color her voice. "I've just finished." Lucy offered a small, wistful smile. "He's always been conscientious about his men, even before." She trailed off, casting a hesitant glance at Ophelia's tall figure. "I'm glad he's found new companionship. He deserves happiness, you know." Ophelia kept her tone measured. "Yes, he does." Once Lucy departed, promising to pick up the dresses in a week, Ophelia sank onto her sewing chair. She wished she could ask Alexander directly about Lucy, but pride or perhaps fear held her back. She remembered how often men in her past had said one thing, only to harbor hidden attachments. Instead of letting doubt consume her, however, she refocused on the final push of her large commission, aware that any day Alexander might come to inspect the completed items. Sure enough, one snowy evening, he arrived with a couple of loggers to collect the mass of winter garments. He tested a coat's stitching, nodded in approval at the triple reinforced elbows, and counted out the remainder of her payment in carefully folded bills. "This is beyond what we agreed upon," Ophelia commented, eyebrows raised. "You surpassed my expectations," Alexander replied. "Good work deserves good pay." He locked gazes with her, that mixture of respect and something more warming her to the core. "Besides, the men are already praising your skill." In the hush that followed, Ophelia felt compelled to speak. "I've been hearing rumors that Lucy Parker is back in town. She took a breath, forging onward. "Was she not? Did you two?" She didn't know how to frame the question gracefully, but the look in her eyes likely conveyed her concern. His face tightened, pain flickering over his features. "We were engaged once, yes. She left, uncertain about the rough life here, and uncertain about me." He exhaled sharply. "It's in the past." Ophelia's chest tightened. "Is it truly past?" Alexander stepped closer, heedless of the curious stares from his men. "Ophelia," he said quietly, Lucy made her choice. I made mine. I respect her, but my feelings changed long ago. I promise you that. Relief battled lingering caution in her heart. She nodded. All right, I just needed reassurance, I suppose. His tone softened. I can give you that, and more. He reached for her hand, but paused mid-gesture, aware they weren't alone. Clearing his throat, he turned back to his loggers, instructing them to load the crates. Before he left that night, he murmured, I'll see you soon if you don't mind. Not at all, she replied, a small smile lifting her lips. As the men filed out with her handiwork, Ophelia felt the swift undercurrent of something intangible pulling her and Alexander together. If Lucy Parker's reappearance introduced any complications, they paled next to the sense of conviction in his voice when he spoke. With winter's chill descending on Silver Pine Gulch, she sensed that her future, uncertain as it was, might also be the warmest she'd ever known. Winter arrived in earnest, with heavy snow piling up along the eaves of the boarding house and blanketing the pine forest outside town. For many, it was a time to hunker down, yet Alexander Redwood's camp pressed on. Logging continued cautiously as the roads became icy and the threat of avalanches loomed in the higher elevations. Ophelia worried for him and his men, checking daily for news. They had enough winter gear, she reassured herself, so they were as prepared as they could be. Then, one bitterly cold afternoon, a frantic pounding at Geraldine Hines's door startled Ophelia out of her sewing. She rushed to find one of the loggers from Redwood Camp, face streaked with sweat, breath clouding in the frosty air, relaying that Alexander had been injured by a sudden slide on Raven Peak Ridge. Her heart lurched. The man explained that a chunk of mountain had collapsed under the weight of fresh snow. Alexander had managed to shove two of his crew out of harm's way, but in doing so he'd taken the brunt of the slide. Now he was badly hurt, with a broken leg, possibly ribs, and was pinned under debris before they could free him. Ophelia didn't wait for further detail. She flung on a heavy cloak, ignoring the stinging swirl of white flakes outside, and followed the logger toward Dr. Hendrix's small clinic. The wind whipped at her skirt as they trudged through snowbanks, the hush of dread heavy in the air. Arriving at the modest wooden building, they found it a hub of commotion. Lucy Parker and Dr. Hendrix hurried in and out of a back room carrying linens and bandages. 3 loggers paced near a stove, their expressions grim. Ophelia forced her way to the back room where Dr. Hendrix and Lucy worked over Alexander's prone form. He lay on a cot far too small for his tall frame, face ashen, eyes half closed. His right leg was splinted in a crude device, and blood stained the bandages around his brow. The doctor scowled, but, recognizing her, let Ophelia pass. He keeps asking for you, Lucy said softly, stepping aside. Stunned by the pallor of his skin and the uncharacteristic weakness in his eyes, Ophelia knelt beside the bed. She gently took his hand, which felt oddly cold despite the roaring fireplace in the next room. Alexander, she said, voice trembling. I'm here. He stirred, cracking his eyes open. His breathing was shallow, laced with pain, yet he managed a faint, grateful smile. You came faster than I expected, he rasped. Of course I did. Don't be foolish, she murmured, pressing her free hand to his cheek. She felt the shift of his muscles as he tried to lean into her touch, though pain clearly limited his movement. Miss Clarkson, I need space to set his leg properly, Dart Hendrix announced, gathering splints and fresh bandages. Lucy was already prepping some form of medicinal tincture. Reluctantly, Ophelia stood back but refused to leave the room entirely. She watched as they carefully cut away more of Alexander's torn pant leg, revealing bruises and a jagged bone misalignment. The doctor spoke in a calm, businesslike tone. We'll need to realign the bone. It'll be excruciating. Lucy, be ready with that laudanum. Miss Clarkson might help if you talk to him. Ophelia positioned herself at Alexander's head, smoothing his damp hair and whispering comforting words. He clenched his jaw as the doctor and Lucy manipulated the broken bone. A strangled groan escaped his lips, and Ophelia fought back tears, forcing herself to remain steady for his sake. Finally, with a sickening crack, the bone was eased into place, and Dr. Hendrix bound the leg with skillful precision. Hours later, the adrenaline ebbed, leaving Ophelia slumped in a chair. The clinic quieted. Lucy Parker made up a cot for her uncle in an adjacent room, anticipating a long night's watch. The temperature outside plummeted, wind rattling the windows. Meanwhile, Alexander drifted in and out of fitful consciousness, occasionally whispering for water or wincing from a cough that pulled at cracked ribs. At one point, Lucy touched Ophelia's shoulder. "He's stable for now, but he needs rest. Might be best if you go home. It'll be days before we see real improvement." Ophelia shook her head. "I'll sleep here." The thought of leaving him alone in this battered state felt unbearable. Lucy hesitated, then nodded. "Stay if you must. Just let him rest. If fever sets in, we'll need you to fetch more supplies." Her manner was professional, yet a glimmer of empathy shone in her eyes. That night, Ophelia dozed in a stiff-backed chair, waking whenever Alexander stirred. In the flickering lamplight, she watched him struggle to breathe against bruised ribs, a sheen of sweat beading on his brow. No official vow bound them, but she felt fiercely that she belonged here, by his side, fighting for him however she could. By dawn, Dr. Hendricks declared Alexander's temperature normal. Though danger still lurked in potential infection or complications, the immediate crisis had passed. Ophelia finally allowed herself a shaky exhale of relief. She felt Lucy's gaze from across the room. No rivalry in that moment, just a silent understanding that they both cared for him, albeit in different ways. Ophelia squeezed Alexander's hand, silently praying he'd pull through, determined not to let this harsh land claim another life. Word of Alexander Redwood's accident spread quickly, fueling concern in Silver Pine Gulch. Some predicted he'd be incapacitated for weeks, if not months. Others gossiped about how a man like him would endure idle confinement. For Ophelia, days blurred together as she divided her time between finishing last-minute sewing projects, now a welcome distraction, and tending to Alexander at Dr. Hendricks's clinic. Lucy Parker, though reserved, allowed Ophelia to assist with daily care, from checking bandages to coaxing him into taking broth. Their interactions remained polite, each recognizing that Alexander's well-being superseded any old or new tensions. Thomas Whitmore also made an appearance at the clinic. Uninvited, he arrived one chilly morning with a practiced air of sympathy and a box of confections from the mercantile. Ophelia's hackles rose at the sight of him in the narrow hallway. He offered a bland smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Clarkson, how is our local foreman faring?" "Mr. Redwood is recovering, thanks to Der Hendricks," she replied coolly. "He needs rest." Thomas nodded gravely. "A pity. The lumber trade is vital to our settlement, and Redwood's absence could stall all sorts of progress." Something about his measured tone implied more. "I also hear rumors that the Northern Pacific Line might be routing through these forests, which could bring new opportunities if Redwood's hold on that territory is loosened. Times are changing." The insinuation was clear. With Alexander incapacitated, Thomas hoped to expand his own interests. She fought the urge to argue. "He'll be back on his feet sooner than you think." Thomas pressed a hand theatrically to his chest. "I certainly hope so. Please give him my regards." With that, he pivoted and left, his steps oddly triumphant for someone feigning concern. Ophelia, seething, carried the confections to Alexander's bedside. Wait. Alexander, propped up on pillows, recognized the brand name and grimaced. "Whitmore's token of goodwill, I suppose?" She nodded. "He claims to care about your recovery, but I suspect otherwise." Alexander's eyes flashed with frustration. If he's circling, that means he's up to something bigger than petty grudges. Indeed, over the next few days, the local chatter amplified. It turned out that a vote would be held soon by the town council, potentially endorsing a new railroad route that could cut straight through Redwood Logging's precious old-growth stands. Many believed Thomas Whitmore was pushing for this route, seeing it as a chance to exploit more land and overshadow Redwood's operation. Hearing the news, Alexander nearly climbed out of bed despite his splinted leg, insisting he had to attend the meeting. But Dr. Hendricks balked at the idea. "You can barely hobble from the bed to the chair, Redwood. That meeting is in a week. You're not leaving this clinic yet." Ophelia stepped forward. "He has to go, or the council might side with Whitmore's plan. There's too much at stake." Alexander met her eyes, determination and a spark of vulnerability mingling in his gaze. "Help me get there, Ophelia. I won't let the forest be destroyed by short-term greed." She placed her hand over his. "We'll figure it out. If I have to drag you there on a sled, I will." Her vow drew a faint grin from him. Throughout that week, Alexander's mood swung between restless anger at his forced inactivity and gratitude for Ophelia's companionship. Lucy came and went, tending strictly to medical aspects. Thomas Whitmore, ironically, flitted around town hall, whispering about the potential benefits of rapid expansion. Geraldine Hines, well attuned to local politics, reported to Ophelia that some council members were swayed by the promise of quick profit, while others feared deforestation and environmental damage. The entire outcome might hinge on Redwood's input. By the day of the council session, Ophelia and two loyal loggers contrived a way to transport Alexander from the clinic. Braced with splints and wrapped in heavy blankets, he was carefully lifted onto a sturdy chair mounted on a wagon bed. The journey from the clinic to the small hall was slow, made precarious by fresh snow. Ophelia walked beside him, ready to steady the chair at every jolt. He winced with each bump, but never complained, eyes locked on the building that loomed ahead. Inside, the space overflowed with townsfolk. Judge Peterson, a graying man with sharp eyes, led the council. Thomas Whitmore stood near the front, speaking fervently of new rail lines, Jibadinbom, and commerce. Many listeners nodded, but a few looked uneasy. When Alexander Redwood was wheeled in, a hush fell, broken only by mutterings of surprise. He cleared his throat, voice resonating despite his weakened state. "I may be injured, but I'm still part of this town. My men and I have a stake in how we grow." Judge Peterson signaled for him to speak, and Alexander painted a picture of sustainable logging, cautioning against decimating prime forest. He argued that the southern route for the railroad would provide nearly as much benefit without ravaging the old growth. Then Ophelia found herself standing, compelled to add her voice. She introduced herself as a new resident who recognized the delicate balance of frontier progress. She described how short-term thinking had upended entire communities back east. Her words, earnest and candid, drew murmurs of approval. Thomas Whitmore shot her a glare. "With all due respect, Miss Clarkson, you're hardly an objective party. You're aligned with Redwood." Ophelia refused to flinch. "I'm aligned with the well-being of this town, Mr. Whitmore. I've seen how redwood logging fosters longevity, not just a brief boom followed by desertion." When the council retired to deliberate, tension flooded the room. Alexander, pale from pain, squeezed Ophelia's hand. "Whatever happens, thank you for standing by me," he whispered. Judge Peterson and the council chair returned in under an hour, announcing a closed vote. The decision, the Southern Railroad, sparing redwood logging's old-growth stands, won out by a single vote. A surge of relief swept through the onlookers. Applause erupted, though Thomas Whitmore's forced smile revealed simmering resentment. He bowed stiffly to the council and left abruptly, muttering something about lost opportunities. Ophelia turned to Alexander, tears of relief in her eyes. "We did it." He nodded, exhaustion washing over him. "You were magnificent," he breathed, standing tall for what matters. Heart full, she leaned over, ignoring any onlookers. "Couldn't have done otherwise. You've shown me that we all need the freedom to stand." His worn features brightened into a faint smile. "And I want to stand beside you for a long time, Ophelia Clarkson." After the council victory, Alexander's convalescence at the clinic changed from stifling to triumphant. He even persuaded Dr. Hendricks to let him move to Geraldine Hines's boarding house for the remainder of his recovery. Geraldine happily cleared space in a ground-floor parlor so he wouldn't have to tackle stairs. Freed from the clinic's confines, Alexander regained some color in his cheeks, though he remained dependent on crutches and occasionally grimaced with each step. Ophelia coordinated his transition seamlessly, taking every measure to ensure he was comfortable. She spent hours reading aloud to him, sometimes poetry, sometimes forest management manuals. They found a gentle rhythm. She'd stitch quietly while he dozed. They'd share midday meals discussing the future of redwood logging, and in the evenings they'd wander into heartfelt conversation about life, love, and the swirling complexities of a frontier town. Geraldine teased them with a grandmotherly warmth, quick to hush any rumors by reminding people, he's recovering from a grievous injury, and she's helping him heal. Let them be. Lucy Parker visited infrequently now, checking Alexander's leg and changing bandages. Any past tension between the two women softened in the face of Alexander's unwavering devotion to Ophelia. Lucy ultimately confided in her, admitting she'd once felt overshadowed by the harsh realities of logging life. But it's obvious how you two fit, Lucy said at the close of one checkup. I can't begrudge you a happiness that I was never willing to claim. Meanwhile, Thomas Whitmore drifted on the periphery. He attempted to garner support for expansions to his sawmill, but lacked the same moral authority that Redwood had earned. He sporadically lobbed barbs at Ophelia's business or Redwood's enterprise. But the majority of townsfolk now saw through him. His dismissal of Ophelia at the train station had backfired, ironically boosting her status as a resilient newcomer. Still, every time she glimpsed him crossing the street or muttering under his breath outside the saloon, she wondered if he'd given up his animosity or merely bided his time. As Alexander's ribs mended and his leg began to bear weight, the bond between him and Ophelia blossomed into an unspoken promise. She felt it in the way he watched her across a room, the subtle flush that rose in his cheeks whenever he mentioned our future. Geraldine, with her usual frankness, cornered Ophelia in the sewing room one afternoon. So, dear, are you and Alexander Redwood planning something official or just floating along in perpetual courtship? Ophelia pricked her finger at the abruptness of the query. Well, nothing's been formally declared. He's still healing. I don't want to press him. Geraldine arched an eyebrow. Healing physically, sure, but that man's mind is set. Anyone can see it. She planted a supportive hand on Ophelia's shoulder. The question is, are you equally sure? Glancing at the spool of thread in her lap, Ophelia thought about all she'd been through. The sting of Thomas's rejection, the freedom she'd found forging her own path, and the unyielding kindness of Alexander Redwood. I believe I am, she said softly. If he asked me, I'd say yes. Mischief sparkled in Geraldine's eyes. Let's see how soon that happens. She bustled out, leaving Ophelia feeling both amused and self-conscious. In the final stage of his recovery, Alexander progressed to using a sturdy wooden cane. One snowy morning, he beckoned Ophelia to accompany him on a careful walk around the block. The sun glinted on banks of white, and the air smelled of pine and wood smoke. Bundled in heavy coats, they made slow progress, stopping often to admire icicles or catch a breath of the bracing cold. At one corner, he paused and turned to her, leaning on his cane. You've changed my life, he said, voice low, breath puffing white in the cold. Not just because you saved me from losing the land or helped me heal, but because you let me see what it means to have someone stand with me. Her heart fluttered. She set a hand lightly on his arm. You've changed mine too. He took a breath, eyes gliding over the silent street. I've never been one for big speeches, Ophelia. But there's something important I need to say. A faint tremor laced his voice. Once I've fully recovered, I want to marry you. If you'll have me. It felt both surreal and absolutely right. Alexander Redwood, she managed. I'd stand beside you no matter what. You know that. He laughed, a rumble that somehow warmed the winter air around them. I hoped you might feel that way. She ran her gloved fingertips over the scar near his temple, acquired during the rescue that nearly took his life. You're sure you want to link yourself with a woman known for overshadowing men? He leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her brow. You don't overshadow me. You illuminate me. Later they returned to Geraldine's house, flushed with cold, but a light from within. Over supper that evening, a quiet understanding passed among them all. The man who had once nearly died under a crushing slide was alive and forging a new path. And the woman once cast aside at the train station, had become his partner in every sense. The next day they shared the news with Dr. Hendricks and Lucy, who expressed sincere happiness. Lucy gave Ophelia a faint, slightly wistful smile but said, He's chosen well. Don't doubt it. Still, a final piece of closure loomed. While no one expected an apology or blessing from Thomas Whitmore, Ophelia felt an odd sense of peace, thinking how his rejection had set the entire chain of events in motion. It was a testament to how fate sometimes wore strange disguises. With Alexander Redwood at her side, the shadows of her old heartbreak no longer weighed. She was free to stand tall, precisely the way she was always meant to. Spring thaw arrived as if the land itself was celebrating Ophelia Clarkson and Alexander Redwood's union. Melting snow revealed carpets of wildflowers peeking through the forest edges. Birds sang in the towering pines, and the entire valley glowed under gentler sunshine. 3 months had passed since Alexander's injury, and while he still walked with a slight limp, his strength had largely returned. The Redwood logging camp welcomed him back with cheers, though the new protocols and leadership structures he'd set up proved the camp could function even in his absence. By April, final wedding preparations occupied the attention of the entire boarding house. Geraldine Hines's parlor bustled with activity as Ophelia measured out fabric for her own gown. She found it both surreal and fitting that the woman once called too tall to be a proper bride was now stitching her own wedding dress. This time, however, she crafted something that celebrated her height. A cream-colored gown with understated lace, designed to emphasize her long lines rather than mask them. The ceremony took place in the modest white church with peeling paint that had first caught her eye upon arriving in Silver Pine Gulch. Judge Peterson, wearing a formal jacket, stood at the front with the local reverend, officiating in a joint capacity to honor Redwood's contributions to the town's prosperity. The pews filled with residents from every corner of the settlement, loggers in carefully pressed shirts the ranchers Ophelia had sewn for, the blacksmith and his wife, even Lucy Parker and Dr. Hendricks looking genuinely pleased. As Ophelia stepped into the aisle, hush fell over the congregation. She hadn't tried to hide her height or stoop to conventional norms. Her posture was proud, the gentle train of her dress gliding behind her. Lantern light through the windows cast golden patterns on the floor. Up by the altar, Alexander stood tall, a carefully tailored suit accentuating his broad shoulders and the slight cane he still used for support. When his gaze locked on Ophelia, relief, joy, and love mingled openly on his face. She reached him, heart thrumming in her ears. The faint echo of all her old insecurities, of being too tall, too bold, too unorthodox, faded completely under the glow of that moment. Alexander accepted her hand in his large, steady grip. He whispered, "You're breathtaking," softly enough that only she could hear. Judge Peterson cleared his throat, launched into a brief reflection about the unpredictable nature of frontier life, and then the vows commenced. Their voices were clear, unwavering. Ophelia vowed to stand beside Alexander through the uncertain tides of logging, booms, storms, and whatever challenges might come. He promised to cherish her unyielding spirit and respect her independence. Through the exchange of simple rings, they marked their bond, one forged through adversity, mutual support, and love that disregarded the superficial judgments of others. By the authority vested in me by this territory, Judge Peterson concluded, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss carefully, given that height difference. A ripple of good-natured laughter spread, but Alexander needed no further prompting. He raised a hand to her cheek, guided her face to his, and they sealed their union with a tender, lingering kiss that drew applause and cheers. Outside, sunshine drenched the small crowd. Geraldine dabbed her eyes, murmuring about finally seeing that man find his equal. Lucy Parker offered quiet congratulations, and the Redwood loggers boisterously announced they'd be celebrating at the saloon later. Amid the milling, happy throng, Ophelia spotted Thomas Whitmore lurking near the edge of the churchyard. His expression was inscrutable, perhaps regret, perhaps resignation. Their gazes met, and he gave the barest nod, tipping his hat before disappearing down the street. She found herself surprisingly untroubled by the sight. Let him go on his own path. She had chosen hers. Later that day, the newlyweds joined friends for a modest feast at Geraldine's house. A mix of laughter and toasts filled the evening air. Alexander, leaning on his cane less and less, guided Ophelia outside for a stolen moment. Lantern light spilled over them as he slipped an arm around her waist, pressing her gently against him. Remember when we first danced at the church social? He asked. She laughed. Yes, I thought we'd clumsily trip over each other. And we did, a bit, but it led us here. He brushed a stray curl from her forehead. I love you. Thank you for being my partner. She peered into his earnest blue eyes, heart swelling. I love you too, Alexander Redwood, and I can't wait to see what we build together. They stepped onto the porch. The night sky stretched vast and clear, stars burning bright above the evergreen silhouettes. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, as if acknowledging the union. Ophelia leaned her head against her new husband's shoulder, thinking how improbable yet perfect it was that a humiliating rejection had landed her here, amid the hush of Oregon pines, as a cherished wife and respected seamstress. Nothing about her story had gone according to plan, yet it ended more beautifully than she could have imagined. In the days, months, and years to follow, Ophelia and Alexander would stand side by side through expansions of redwood logging, new families moving into Silver Pine Gulch, and the evolving frontier. But on this day, a day of vows and joy, they savored the sheer wonder of having found love in a place that initially spurned her for her height. Now, no one in that town could recall her as anything but the graceful woman who made it her home, the unflinching seamstress who helped shape its destiny. Their union became part of the local lore, often told whenever an outsider asked about the tall bride who arrived at the station, unwanted, and walked away taller than anyone expected, into the arms of a man who saw her as the perfect match. What happens when the woman you've been waiting for turns out to be more than you bargained for, quite literally head and shoulders above the rest? In this captivating frontier tale, the moment of truth arrives right on the train platform, where a man sees the bride he's promised to marry and rejects her on the spot for being too tall. Heartbroken but determined, our heroine refuses to fade into the background, carving out a life in a rugged logging town that proves her worth in ways no one expects. Will this rejection be the end of her dream, or the spark that leads her to something far better? Stay with us for the full story to find out how courage and genuine acceptance triumph over narrow-mindedness. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to support stories like this. By subscribing, you'll help us share more heartfelt narratives and ensure you never miss an update.